Welcome back to Night Talk. Get to the point. I'm Lenny McAllister. You're watching the Pittsburgh Cable News Channel. Tonight we're talking about the hashtag movement Black Lives Matter. What are the constraints, what are the parameters, and where is it going moving forward? Minister Victor Mohammed, we keep talking about this, and I want to challenge it, because my frustration with this hashtag activism is the fact that it seems to be singularly focused too often at a time. It seems to be trendy, and that gets to be very disappointing, because there are a lot of challenges out there. Now, we oftentimes, and we're seeing this nationally, where it is focused primarily on police brutality, but can that not apply to all the other things that we've been talking about and that we've been addressing, from education to jobs to employment, things along those lines, to health care? When is it going to be where we see the natural bridge for this Black Lives Matter movement to go from just talking about white police officers and the criminal justice system versus African Americans to getting to a point in time where we say, number one, we need to make sure Black Lives Matter in these contexts, so that, two, we can strengthen our nation, so we can get back to being a United States of America again versus what we've become over the last 10 years?
Well, you know, one of the great names that was placed in America was called the melting pot. The only time I've seen a melting pot was in science class, and it was a little object called a crucible, and it had to be under extreme heat where different metals that did not belong together would go together and create a stronger alloy. With that being the case, as long as America has been under extreme heat, then she was a melting pot. Black people have answered every call to war, from the Revolutionary War up until now, where they can't get out of the Middle East. So everything that a citizen was supposed to do, black people have done, from the first man that died for this country, Crispus Attucks, up until now. We have to take this to justice, period, across the board. So we're making a demand for that justice.
And you're talking about doing that for the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March.
Of the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March. We're taking our demands to Congress and telling them justice or else.
But is that demand for justice that is being made on the 20th anniversary of the march, is that going to be based on just the police aspects of this, or is that going to be based on the fact that over the last 10 years, a whole lot of African Americans have fallen out of the middle class? Since the beginning of the Great Recession, we have seen black wealth drop by around 30 to 35%, both under President Bush and President Obama, who is now a two-term president, that a lot of African Americans, again, don't seem to hold accountable for that, despite the fact that he's won 2 elections and he did have control of the Congress the initial part of his presidency. So when it comes to things like the march, is it going to be about everything and saying, hey, we need a new path forward, or is it just about, hey, we need to stop seeing our guys and our ladies dying in the streets like this at the hands of police?
Well, since we've had the Pledge of Allegiance, there's been a hypocrisy in it that said justice for all. The Honorable Louis Farrakhan wants to go to D.C. and, in fact, ensure justice for all. He doesn't only want justice for black people, he wants justice for veterans who went to war in the name of a lie and can't come back and get proper service and get proper treatment. He wants equal wages for women, where we do not believe a woman's biology should dictate her rate of pay if she's doing the same amount of work as a man is doing. We want equality in education, but also opportunities. You have $440 million going into Pittsburgh right now, and they act like black people should be happy by being minority contractors, and that we have to become certified minority contractors, even though the certified owners of these projects, the white owners, are not becoming certified.
And we know that the workforce diversity here is the lowest among the benchmark cities that they're compared against in the United States, and we continuously hear these bad numbers here in Pittsburgh alone. Dr. Duck, are these demands that they're talking about doing in the fall, is this something that mirrors what we've seen in other civil rights movement? Is this what validates Black Lives Matter, saying this is a true civil rights movement? This isn't just hashtag activism. This isn't a series of events strung together. This is an actual 21st century civil rights movement. Are these the type of things, these the type of demands that validate that?
I do. I think what Black Lives Matter, the various groups that are associated with Black Lives Matter are doing some amazing work that we don't hear about. I think the problem is, as an American, to see, you know, black men and women die at the hands of law enforcement every week is a way to keep that on the radar, but we don't see the stuff that Leon is doing behind the scenes, or Minister is doing behind the scenes as well. But there are organizers who are addressing things like education, equality, who are trying to do prison and jail reform and how people are treated in our prisons and jails. There are people who are doing things as it relates to housing. There are people who are fighting for the, the fight for 15. So it's not one monolithic issue. I think it's a number of issues under the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So I think, again, I don't want to dismiss what young people are doing, having their voice to speak for what's issues that are important to them, and this is their moment, this is their time. I think at different periods of history, there were social conditions that required a particular type of response. We're in an information age. This is how young people are communicating.
But we're not hearing a lot about accountability for the things that are in place right now. And Leon, I'm going to go to you first, and I'll go around the table real quick. It's not as though we're starting where we were in 1954, where there were no black congressmen, no black legislators, no black millionaires, no black businessmen that had any type of impact in the mainstream of America. It's completely different. Yet, when we talk about, again, Black Lives Matter, there's no level of accountability towards African Americans and those that do have some access to power to say, listen, how come we have a lot of middle-class African Americans that have not stayed in our communities? How come we do not have a lot of black wealth sticking around and being spent more in our communities? So when it comes to that, do you think that your generation, now pass it around the table, do you think that your generation is also starting to hold people accountable and saying, hey, you've been in charge for quite some time, where are the results of what you're supposed to have been doing for us for the last several years?
For sure, and it's sparking a huge disconnect. There's been a disconnect between young people and their elders, just as there's a disconnect between the police force and young people. And a lot of times in our communities now, like with people like me, we're addressing these issues. I'm in a position where I'm trying to bridge the gap with the leaders that's worth it. But it's a tough job.
But that's so ironic that you would say, because I hear him laughing, but I get the point of what you're saying. Your generation's looking at this and saying, okay, you have a title, but you're not a leader. And I guess that's the question I want to get back to when we come back from break is, where do we go at this point in time when you start engaging Black Lives Matter as a philosophy and start looking around and seeing we have black leaders, we have black people in place, we still have the results that we have right now. How does that change and stay consistent with Black Lives Matter? Continue that conversation next. Welcome back. We're continuing the conversation about Black Lives Matter. Leon Ford Jr., you brought up something that not only made Brother Victor Muhammad chuckle, but it was one of the most poignant things that you hear from your generation, which is, I will deal with leaders that are worth it. Now, I look at that in a political context and I say, Congress has an approval rating of 10%, but 90% of them get reelected. We just heard of an African-American congressman that just got indicted in Philadelphia. A couple years earlier, I was in Chicago when an African-American congressman was indicted. You see these things in the corruption in politics, whether it's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or from coast to coast. Then you see it in the communities as well, where community leaders continue to get the grants and the communities look the same exact way. If Black Lives Matter, how do we break that cycle so that we can fulfill that mantra in all senses?
Well, number one for me was, when I got shot, I had to become my own hero. I didn't look for a leader in a community or a national leader to come save me. My thing was saving myself. And that's what we're doing. We're saving ourselves. And in the process of saving ourselves, we're becoming more educated on politics, on different things that's going on in our neighborhood and on a national level. Just recently there was a meeting in East Liberty. We found out that they were trying to do some redevelopment and they were going to try to get the basketball court. Well, the fact that they were trying to get the basketball court brought out hundreds of young people, right? So every day there's different things going on that's empowering or getting young people more engaged, and that's helping people like me, young men like me, out a ton.
Victor, I'm going to take this to you, then I want to bring it back over to Waverly Duck. You brought up the Tea Party as an example of taking a page from the civil rights movement and basically leveraging that to get the social changes that they're talking about. But maybe this is time for those that support Black Lives Matter to take a page out of the Tea Party book, which is basically looking at the leaders that are in place. And if they have dissatisfaction with them, dumping them and moving them out the door. The Tea Party's been doing it for the last 5 years. They got rid of everybody from the majority leader in Congress all the way down to governors. So if they can do that from a political sense, is it time for those that support Black Lives Matter to look at black leadership and say, your time is done, here's your gold watch, it's time for you to leave? Or is it something where we should be saying, oh, let's pump our brakes and maybe we shouldn't go quite that far?
Well, I go back to the last segment when you talked about it's not like 1954 where we didn't have black representatives. However, in the reconstruction of this country, we did have black representatives, and we still ended up lynched. We still ended up broke down, and now.
But that was because laws changed. That was because the Klan came in. That was because it was a huge shift. It's not the same. It's not the same political.
Now we have legal lynchings. Now we have more black politicians being indicted, even though we're fewer in number. We're being indicted more than any other politicians. And something is wrong with that.
But they're still being replaced by black politicians as well. It's not as, I mean, they're, for example,
it's still illegal lynching, but because it is not their system. If they were congressmen, they wouldn't need a congressional black caucus if being a congressman was good enough. If they didn't, if they had the power that is suggested, they wouldn't have to have subsidiary organizations to back them as African American leaders to justify them being in Congress. But since they don't have that power, they're looking for any type of benefit that they can get.
But the flip side of that, Dr. Duck, is the fact that a lot of these individuals get into these majority-minority districts. They stay there. They know that they're not going to have any competition. And you have Charlie Rangel that will stay there for 45 years. Jesse Jackson, when he got indicted, he was there for 20 years. Shaka Fattah's been there since 1994. They stay in these safe, gerrymandered, comfortable districts, and rather than making that move to become a senator like Barack Obama did or Kara Mosley Braun did in Illinois, they stay there because they know the pension's coming. And people have said this type of complaint from gerrymandered districts in cities where Democrats and black Democrats have dominated for decades now, all the way through to the Congressional Black Caucus. And if that's the case and if that's the tone, isn't that a problem with the culture within our movement versus blaming the system outside of it?
I think the issue, I don't think it's, the black politicians are, the problem. I think the entire system is problematic, and it doesn't affect, lifelong black politicians who were fighters during the civil rights movement, who had been loyal to these communities and kept up, programs that were important to those communities. I think where we're at now, this country is changing.
But is that Shaka Fattah when he's caught racketeering? Is that Jesse Jackson Jr. when he's caught spending money on Michael Jackson memorabilia? It's kind of hard to make that case when those things are coming out.
That very well will be the case, but I mean, who the governor of Illinois, the previous two governors of Illinois, both were indicted. So there's something incarcerated, yes. There's something problematic about the political system itself. I think the issue here now is that I think there's young people who are challenging the system and saying that it must be reorganized. So many people who are being born today half the people who are being born today are non-white. So we have changing demographics in this country. Around about 60% of the population, or a little over 60% of the population is white. There is going to have to be a shift. We're going to have to figure out who's going to take the place of baby boomers, and it's young people like Leon Ford. They're young people who are looking at 2.3 million people in prison, 7 million people under surveillance, 19 million people with criminal records, and saying there's something, and most of these people are being people of color, that there's something inherently wrong with the system and how people are being treated.
Right, so
I think these young people are challenging those issues and saying that, it doesn't have to be one platform about violence or education or housing. It can be about a number of things: access to wages, unemployment. I think it's a huge problem, but these politicians, to keep looking and saying that it's only black politicians who are being indicted, I think it's much more complex than that. And I think the black leadership things are changing, like a Barack Obama or the young district attorney in Baltimore.
Even if we go to Barack Obama, though, we can look at the black wealth under Barack Obama over the last 7 years, and
we had a major recession, to be fair.
And it has come down, and everybody's come back except African Americans. We have seen President Obama now start getting on the mantle of putting up for African Americans, Victor, over the last basically 6 months to a year. But by and large, this was a president that said a rising tide lift all boats versus being the guy, while he had the Democrats in tow and had all the political capital, that actually spoke out on some of these issues. So even from the presidency down to we had Deval Patrick in Massachusetts as governor, we've talked about the congressional congressman, we've talked about the city councilman. There are things in place. When we start talking about Black Lives Matter, is there going to finally be some type of jolt of energy where that gets invigorated as well, so that black economics gets reinvigorated, black politics gets reinvigorated, or are we going to just lose the momentum of this movement to the Trayvon Martins and some of the other tragedies that we've seen since 2012?
We're not going to lose momentum because they're not going to stop killing us, number one. But it is gaining momentum because we're talking about it right now. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we weren't talking about this at all, as if these problems weren't already happening. What we've seen on the major media front is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a reality that we live in the hood every day. And the young men, we have to learn in particular to stop being killers in our community and become securers of our community.
And that's interesting that you would bring that up, because when we come back, we're going to tie some of what people will say is the All Lives Matter and the black-on-black crime situation back to Black Lives Matter. How can they all be as one and move us forward? We'll continue to talk about that next here on Night Talk. Get to the point.